So I'd like to start off with the first metaphor of the evening. So breaking the ice is, of course, a metaphor, and what better to break the ice than an enormous pair of cuddling polar bears. So let's just get to know each other a little bit. So make sure that we're friends. Make sure that we're in a good space with each other, because we might all be getting our metaphors out later. Who knows? I know. So do just turn to the person next to you and just introduce yourself and say hi very quickly. Much as I'd love to kind of use up lots of time with you just getting to know each other, that would be brilliant. But there'll be plenty of time for that in the bar later, and I probably ought to actually deliver my talk. So, who am I? I know a lot of you. There's a lot of familiar faces here in the space. My name is Bronwyn Nash, and this is a picture of me sat in my camper van. And I use my camper van as a metaphor for a journey, for an adventure, for creating the type of energy that I love to create with my coaching clients. And I'm really looking forward to sharing what this work looks like and what it means to me. There will be a world of other ways of engaging with the world of metaphors and creative imagery and metaphor work. And what I hope that you might get from this talk is perhaps an appreciation of what this work might look like and how it might be so powerful, to perhaps get some inspiration around some different ways to work with your clients, and to whet your appetite to see if you want to find out more about this. So I completed my training with Animas in early 2015 and went on to create my coaching practice, Magic Roundabout Coaching. I called it that because I was working out of my camper van. He's called Zebedee. And this was my kind of vision, that we would have this quirky, creative space to work together in. And I joined Animas as a trainer around the middle of last year, and now I split my time between working for Animas as a trainer, back with the diploma in transformational coaching, from whence I came, and working with my own clients. So, why have I got a picture of Queen up on the screen? It's because of their song, It's a Kind of Magic. I was thinking about what it is about metaphors that really speak to me. And I think the reason I love working with them so much is that they do feel like a kind of magic, that they work at such a powerful transformational level sometimes. So I thought that I could put the lyrics of It's a Kind of Magic up, and we could sing it together and explore the metaphors contained within the song. How does that sound? Yeah. Up for that? I thought some of you might be. I am joking, we're not going to do that. I know, next time. But there is for me something mysterious about working with when I first started exploring coaching. I loved the experiences when I worked with someone who could just see things in a different way, who could just get to the heart of something, and just help me to profoundly shift my perspective. And I'd come away from encounters like that or sessions like that just thinking, how do they do that? What is this dark art that they have access to? And I actually believe that this is work that can fall into that category of just working in that kind of mysterious, magical kind of way, where we can just get such profound insights and paradigm shifts. Now, something else that I experienced throughout my exploration of coaching and my experience of coaching is that it can feel very left brain. It can feel very logical, very linear, very kind of straight line, a bit like the sort of simple application of the GROW model when we're just looking at a very straightforward goal that we might want to work on with a client. Very linear, very what's step one, what's step two, what's step three. And I think that when we're working in a transformational way with our clients, we kind of can't necessarily work in that very linear way. If we keep on trying to work in that linear way, we're just going to keep on butting up against obstacles and barriers and kind of getting stuck. So for me, it feels really important that we're able to kind of move sideways and move up and down and around the issue, to be able to navigate the maze of what the client might be bringing to us and the maze of what might be going on for them within that. So for me, transformational coaching can be this creative, this engaging, this kind of mysterious, surprising space. And again, I've shared this picture. It's probably quite a familiar picture of what people think success looks like and what it really looks like. And I think we can kind of apply that to coaching, what people might think coaching looks like and what coaching might actually look like. And this is just part of the reason why I've called this talk The Magic of Metaphors, because it is kind of this, for me, this kind of mysterious, magical way of working sometimes. So what does metaphor actually even mean? So if we look in the dictionary, it says that a metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase can stand for something else. Or it could be a thing. So a thing that is representative or symbolic of something else. So it could be verbal or it could be an actual physical thing. And interestingly, the word metaphor has the same roots as the word amphora, which is an ancient Greek vessel that was used for carrying and storing precious liquids. And I think this is really lovely because David Grove, whose work we will touch on very briefly in this talk, actually says that the purpose of a metaphor is to carry this precious information. So it's interesting that the word has the same roots as this ancient Greek vessel. So humans have had a long, long history with symbols and images to convey meaning. So we've got ancient symbols that have been around forever, like the symbol for infinity, and we've got more modern symbols that we're equally familiar with, and they just can convey so much information and so much meaning. And we've also got a very long history of accessing non-ordinary states in order to access wisdom. And what I mean by non-ordinary states is states that aren't just the conscious, logical, cerebral, left-hand brain stuff that we tend to overly rely on, in my opinion, sometimes. So we've got this very familiar metaphor of the iceberg that we come across all the time in coaching, that an iceberg represents the bit that the client might bring to us and what's really going on underneath. But it also often represents the conscious and the subconscious mind. That the conscious might represent just the tip of the iceberg, and the subconscious information, mind and wisdom is all the mass of ice underneath the surface. And I think working with metaphors and symbols can just invite us to shift our state. It can invite us to shift from that surface level, logical left brain thinking, into that deeper wisdom. Something, perhaps shifting our state away from something that isn't working and into something else that might access different or more information. And I think this almost deification of the left logical side of the conscious mind means that perhaps in this society we've kind of gotten into the habit of cutting off our access to so many other sources of information that are actually available to us. And metaphors have been described as the native language of the unconscious mind, which suggests that metaphors are understood by both sides of the mind, the left-hand side, the logical side, and the right-hand side, the more kind of creative and intuitive and subconscious side. And that the metaphors in our words represent the metaphors in our thinking. So there's all kinds of clues in the metaphors that we use in our language and our words that indicate what's actually going on for us and for our clients. And many psychological and linguistic schools of thought have considered metaphors to be simply turns of phrase. But a growing number of scholars, in the reading that I've been doing around this, are coming to the conclusion that metaphor might actually be the underlying process through which we make sense of the world. And you might have heard the phrase, the map is not the territory. Is that familiar? Yes. So this is the idea that the model of the world that we hold in our minds is not exactly the same as the world. It's our symbology, our metaphors, it's the meaning that we've made of that. It's ours personally, our unique model of the world, as opposed to being the actual world. So if metaphors are the way that we make sense of the world, then using metaphor and figurative language starts to make a lot of sense. And we can work in this way because our clients are creative and resourceful people. They're smart, our clients. And if they could have figured out their challenge using their normal way of thinking, they'd probably have done it already. They probably wouldn't be coming to the coaching and be feeling stuck around it. So sometimes we can forget that like a smartphone, we've got access to more than one app. And there might be other apps that we can access that are more useful than just that logical left-hand side of the brain. Clients come to coaching, I would suggest, to think about things in a different way, to have new ideas opened up for them, and to be explored. And to do that, perhaps we need to start inviting the bottom of the iceberg to the party. Now, I'm not an academic expert in metaphors. I am a coach who is just fascinated by this work. I've developed my own ways of working with it, and I want to share some of those ways with you and share my curiosity and my excitement around metaphors with you this evening. But it's certainly not my intention to deliver an academic style lecture telling you all about the kind of the history and the research and the scholars. You know, I'm certainly not an expert, and there's certainly going to be loads of different ways than the ways that I'm going to talk to you about this evening to work with this stuff. So I'm just here to share with you what it looks like from my perspective and how I've developed some of this work in my practice. So, research suggests that we use, on average, 6 metaphors a minute in our dialogue. They're absolutely everywhere. And it's really interesting when we start to tune into them. So tune in, metaphor. We start to tune into these metaphors and we find them everywhere. And if the research is true, and if our clients are using, on average, 6 metaphors a minute, then this whole new world of information just opens up in front of us in our sessions. And we can feel a bit like a kid in a sweet shop. There's just so much of it. It's like kind of accessing a crystal cave full of riches. There's just all this stuff suddenly that we weren't perhaps so conscious or aware of before, that we can start exploring and mining and getting underneath. So metaphors are expressing kind of abstract ideas, concepts, processes in terms of more physical or more concrete aspects of our experience. So they're taking something that's kind of abstract, conceptual, processy, and kind of comparing it to something that's physical and concrete and makes sense to us. And this would suggest that they're much more common than we think they are. So perhaps some of the most obvious metaphors are the overt metaphors that our clients might use, that our clients might bring to us, the kind of the obvious ones. And I'm just wondering, we'll just take like 2 or 3 examples of metaphors that you're aware of that might have perhaps come up in your client sessions, or even that you use in your lives to express what's going on for you. And I just wonder if you could just shout out a couple that kind of spring to mind. What have we got?
A weight has lifted.
A weight has lifted, okay. So we all get this felt sense of what that means, what that looks like. It might take us ages to actually describe the actual experience, but by using the phrase a weight has lifted, we just get this kind of intuitive felt sense of what that means, what that might look like. What else?
Needle in a haystack.
A needle in a haystack. Absolutely, yeah. So again, a really clear way of expressing an experience or a challenge or an issue and what it feels like. So we've got these overt metaphors, and there's a few here. So a knot in my stomach, feeling like I've hit a brick wall, wading through mud, spreading my wings, spinning plates. So these are all types of kind of overt metaphors that we might hear, we might notice. It's kind of like the first level of metaphors that we might start to tune into. But surely our clients aren't using these types of obvious overt metaphors 6 times a minute. So I had a look at what the research actually meant by that, and what they were talking about was also, they were talking about this, but they were also talking about more subtle metaphors, so the less obvious or perhaps the implied metaphors. So they're a little bit more subtle. So it's not obvious at first that chunking up and chunking down might be making use of the metaphor of space. Or logical levels might be making use of the metaphor of structure. Or going into a trance might be making use of the metaphor of a container, going into trance. So there are these examples of less obvious metaphors or implied metaphors that we can start to become aware of as well. And I think this is what the 6 metaphors a minute is talking about. It's talking about all of these types of metaphors that we might start to notice. So I want to just share a little bit about who has influenced the work that we might do with metaphors. Who's kind of, where are the influences coming from? I'm not going to share all of them, but just to give you a bit of a flavour. So the first one is Carl Jung. Familiar name? Yeah. So Carl Jung created and worked with these globally applicable metaphors or archetypes. So he kind of identified and worked with these archetypes that he felt were globally applicable to everybody. So everybody had some kind of a relationship with the archetype of mother or hero, and so on and so forth. Milton Erickson created stories that act as metaphors that could then be shared and offered to the client, often in the work of hypnotherapy. So these were kind of guided stories or guided metaphors, but also having stories that could be shared with a client to help to illustrate a point or to give a different perspective or create new understanding. So examples of those sorts of stories might be the stories around how we might respond and react to change. So using the story of boiling a frog and the story that if we put a frog into cold water that is gradually heated up to boiling point, the frog won't be able to identify what's happening because the change is gradual. Whereas allegedly, never found this out for myself, but if you put a frog into boiling water, it will jump straight back out again because it can tell that this is not a pleasant environment. And turning a steamship. So again, how can we respond to change? So how long does it take for a steamship to be able to change direction? It's not an instant thing. Change happens, but then it might take time. So this is the kind of metaphor work that Milton Erickson explored. And then David Grove, perhaps a little bit more recently, started getting interested in the metaphors that are generated entirely from within the client's experience. And he believed that these metaphors are coded with symbolic information, and that symbolic information is containers for meaning that the client is making. And for me, this is the most probably the most fascinating, or at least the element that I've spent most time exploring, this approach from David Grove.
Yeah.
So he talks about metaphors coming from entirely within the client, so they're entirely client generated, and that the coach would then deliberately work in a way that avoided imposing any of their own judgments or assumptions onto that metaphor. So they would work in a way that was described as clean. So they'd explore the metaphor without bringing in any of their own assumptions or polluting that in the exploration. And he said that these metaphors were just coded, just full of symbolic attributes that could be explored by the coach and the client. So for example, if a client says, I keep running up against a brick wall, then each of the attributes of that wall will be significant. How high it is, how wide it is, what it's made of, how many, if it's made of bricks, how many bricks, what colour are they? Where is the wall in relation to the client? What direction is it running in? What happens next in the story that the client is creating and imagining? So he developed this approach that allows the coach or the therapist, it was originally created for metaphor therapy or symbolic therapy, to be explored, because the metaphor is part of the structure. It contains information about the structure of the client's experience. And unlike the Jungian symbols, the archetypes, which have this universal applicability, these Grovian metaphors are unique and really personal to the client. And in his metaphor model, the elements within that metaphor are significant because they embody this out-of-awareness information. So they're embodying information from the bit of the iceberg that's underneath the water. And by exploring them and identifying them and getting curious about them, we can start to bring this out-of-awareness information up to the level of the client's conscious awareness. So we're bringing new information into the party. And Grove calls the entire mind and body space which contains these symbols the client's metaphoric landscape. And he created an approach called clean language, which some of you might be familiar with, as his way of exploring that landscape with his clients. Now, we're not going to get an opportunity this evening to get into clean language because it's an entire kind of, it could probably fill an entire weekend all on its own if we were really going to get into it. But it's something that if this is kind of resonating with you, you might want to find out more about or investigate it, because we don't have to go for the full-on symbolic modelling training and approach in order to be able to draw out elements of it that can be usefully integrated into our coaching practice and help us to show up in a way that allows us to explore the metaphor without us getting involved in it and starting to pollute it with our own assumptions and judgments. So why would we use metaphors? What are some of your thoughts based on what you've heard already and your own experience of why it might be useful, why it might be valuable to explore metaphors in our coaching practice? What are some of your thoughts? Yes.
Right brain might be able to take them on board more easily.
Right, okay, so the right brain might be able to take them on board more easily and get information out of them that perhaps the left brain might not. Okay, lovely, thank you. We'll go here and then here.
If explaining a situation a client might not be comfortable with, the metaphors are a way of expressing themselves in a way that's a bit more detached.
Right, okay, so they might allow the client to explore something that might perhaps be a bit sensitive or a bit difficult in a way that's a bit, they've created a bit of distance from it. They've got that kind of, it's kind of, we're creating something over here and looking at it from a distance as opposed to it being right up and close and in it. Lovely, thank you.
These metaphors have a big resonance with people, okay? So you say something like on a knife edge, people can actually actually feel that, right? And it's quite interesting because, of course, that feeling can be a very deep thing and open up lots of avenues for exploration.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So very, very quickly it imparts an awful lot of information and can give us this real felt sense of what might be being described. And it can also, have you heard the phrase, picture can speak 1,000 words? So just this symbol or this image or this phrase, this metaphor on a knife edge, just has so much information contained with it, or so much potential information contained with it. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, it also allows the clients maybe to look at whatever this issue is to, from different angles and different points of view.
Yes. Right, so gaining a different perspective. So perhaps they've just been looking at it from one perspective, and it allows the client to kind of start exploring that landscape from lots of different perspectives, generating, again, new information. Lovely, thank you. Thank you for sharing those. I just want to share some of the things that came up for me when I was thinking about this question. So we've touched on this a little bit. So working with metaphors can create very rapid understanding. It might help a client with challenges around self-disclosure. So it might be easier to talk in figurative or abstract or metaphorical language when we're talking about something that's potentially sensitive or difficult to explore. It can perhaps increase self-awareness if we're getting different perspectives from it, if we're generating access to new information. It could increase self-awareness. It could allow us to perhaps bypass intense emotions. So it may be that as we're working with a metaphor or something symbolic, the same level of emotions don't necessarily get triggered or or arise than if we were talking very explicitly and expressly about the reality. Got the point around a picture being worth 1,000 words. It can bypass lengthy descriptions. How long might it take our client to explain the detail of what they mean when they say they feel like they're on a knife edge, as opposed to just using that phrase to get that sense across to us? It can bring in an element of lightness and levity, perhaps even an element of humour if that feels appropriate. So if everything's getting a bit kind of deep and heavy, it can just bring in that lightness or that levity. Again, if that feels appropriate, if that feels useful. It might perhaps feel quite complex and overwhelming to express, more manageable. It can help us to perhaps change our relationship to the issue. And there's an example that I'm going to share a little bit later on from my experience about how a metaphor has enabled me to change my relationship to an issue that I was getting really bogged down in and really stuck in. It might help us, and we've touched on this already, access unconscious resources and new information. Start to tap into that stuff that's underneath the surface, the bottom of the iceberg. It could help us to anchor a desired state. So we might kind of come up with a metaphor that captures how we would like things to be. And it might be that having that image, that very quickly accessible image or metaphor or symbol in our minds, helps us to really anchor that in for us. Not just in our conscious mind, but in our subconscious mind as well, to really anchor that in. And sometimes it can allow us to stay outside the spaghetti of what the client can sometimes bring. I wonder if that metaphor resonates with you in some occasions where what the client brings just feels like this big mass of spaghetti. So sometimes working with metaphor and asking the client to turn what they're bringing into symbols or images can really help us to avoid getting sucked in, whilst at the same time inviting our client to identify what are the most important things and where might they like to start. And finally, I wanted to share the ICF core competencies, competency number 7, which is around direct communication. And the core competencies actually speak to working with metaphors and say that the coach uses metaphor and analogy to help illustrate a point or paint a verbal picture. So this isn't just kind of woo-woo stuff, it's stuff that is recognised by the ICF as being a really important competency, a really important tool that we can bring into our work with our clients. So how do we do that? What I want to do is share with you some of the ways that I use metaphors in my work. It's not intended to be an exhaustive list, but just to get us thinking into what some of this might start to look like. So we can listen for a metaphor. So we can listen to what the client is saying, listen to what the client is sharing with us, and just start to tune in to the metaphors. Apparently there's 6 of them every minute. So we can just listen for them and just feel into which ones might it be useful to start exploring. And a big clue, more for the explicit overt metaphors than the more subtle implied ones, but a big clue that a metaphor's coming is when our client uses the word "it's like." Yeah? It's like I'm on a knife's edge. It's like I'm spinning plates. It's like I'm stuck in the mud. It's like I'm spreading my wings. So often we can use those as a flag to let us know that, oh, right, this is probably a metaphor, something that we might start to be able to explore. We can also elicit metaphors from our clients. We can invite them to create a metaphor. And to do that, we might take these words from, and this comes from David Grove's work around clean language. So we might ask the question, and that's like what? So if our client is explaining a challenge or a situation or something that they're considering or exploring or thinking about, and we want to perhaps simplify it into something that feels like a metaphor, we can ask this question, and that's like what? Which is inviting the client to come up with a metaphor. It might be that they don't understand what we mean by the question, so another way of phrasing it is perhaps if you were to come up with an image or a picture or a symbol that represents what this is like, what might that be? And notice the languaging that I'm using. I'm not saying what would that be, I'm saying what might that be. Because we're inviting the subconscious into the room. And often when we use language that's very much like what are you going to do, what will you do, what would that be, then we can create a bit of pressure to know the answer. When we use language like what might it be, what could it be, what are the possibilities, then we tend to leave the door open for the subconscious and the imagination to come and get involved. We can also offer a metaphor. So we might share what's coming up for me is an image or a picture or a symbol. We might ask permission to share that with our client and check in with them around whether that feels useful to them, whether it's representative. And even if it isn't, because recognising that whatever metaphor might be coming up for us, whatever we might be offering, is coming from our view of the world, from our paradigm, even if it isn't useful, it's often still an invitation for the client to say, well, no, but this would represent it. Or now that you've said that, it's not quite that, but it's this. So even if our metaphor that we're offering isn't quite hitting the spot, it can often be the trigger or the catalyst for the client to then generate one of their own. We might work with, we might invite metaphors in by working with imagery or pictures, photos, image cards, drawings, or visualizations. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like in a while. We might think about physical or 3D metaphors. So I've brought in these poker chips, which I kind of carry around in my coaching kit. This is an example of a physical or a 3D metaphor, where I ask my client to imagine that these poker chips represent their resources in a particular situation. So it might represent their time or their energy or their attention in any given situation. And that's it. There's a finite amount of it. So then I invite them to use the poker chips to think about how are they allocating those resources. And sometimes just having something physical that is a metaphor or a symbol to represent those resources helps to create that clarity around, yes, it is a finite resource, and yes, if I'm spending it in places that are less important, then the things that are important to me might not be getting the resources that they need. So sometimes just something very, very simple like this can be very powerful. And I've also sometimes, in my client work, co-created symbolic acts where the client has decided that it would be useful to, for example, use the application of body lotion in the morning to symbolise putting on a layer of kind of positive energy that will sustain them throughout the day. Or that the client has decided that they will use having a shower in the morning to symbolise washing away anything that's negative or unhelpful or unwanted or negative automatic thoughts, limiting beliefs, that they will use that as a kind of a symbolic act. And I had one client who decided that when she put her socks on in the morning, she was going to imbue them with the power to keep her grounded throughout the day. So her socks became a metaphor or a symbol for remaining grounded and solid and strong and anchored throughout the day. So we can create these symbolic acts, or co-create these symbolic acts with our clients as well. This is a picture from a coaching session that took place in my camper van. And this was the client and I using a bendy man, which I also have a few of these in my coaching bag. And it was a bit cold and rainy outside, and we didn't want to go outside, so we used the bendy man to represent the client, and we used the squares on the floor to represent timelines. And the client and I then explored travelling through different timelines to explore how different decisions and different options might play out. So we can just use what's around us as well, and just be creative with creating these 3D metaphors. Yes?
Can that be used in future facing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So this is one of my personal stories. So from confusion to clarity, a personal paradigm shift. So I just want to illustrate the paradigm shift that a metaphor can create. It's not always going to do this. I don't want to create false expectations. Bronwyn said that if I brought metaphors into my client work, there'd be a paradigm shift. I want my money back. But it can have this effect. So recently, over the last few months, I have been working on developing a new brand. And this new brand is an evolution of the work that I'm already doing. And everything was going great, and I was motoring along, thinking, yeah, this is great, I had this vision, was getting really clear about it. And then I started getting bogged down, and I started getting stuck. And I got to the point where I started feeling really lost and stuck, and nothing was really flowing with ease, and I couldn't really understand why things weren't going the way I expected them to go. And after a while I started thinking, it's me. And it started triggering anxiety for me and doubts about my own capability. Because I was thinking, this is easy stuff, this is straightforward, this is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Why is it so hard? And I started getting really bogged down in it. And then I found this metaphor. Is there anyone in the room that's got an aversion to caterpillars? Speak now, because I'm about to show a picture of a caterpillar. It's big. Okay, good. Just checking. This is one of the reasons why we need to be a bit cautious as well when we're offering metaphors. I have heard, and this doesn't happen this never happened to me, but I have heard of someone offering a metaphor of a snake shedding its skin, and the client had a, phobia. Yeah, had a phobia about snakes. It didn't go well. Everyone was okay, but it didn't go quite how the coach was expecting it to go. So I came across this metaphor of a caterpillar and a chrysalis. And this metaphor enabled me to look at the whole situation from a different perspective, because what I realised I'd been doing is trying to be the caterpillar and trying to be the chrysalis at the same time. And when I was able to look at it in that way and realise there's a reason that the caterpillar stops being a caterpillar and then becomes the chrysalis, and that the caterpillar can't actually become the chrysalis and keep the caterpillar going at the same time, that metaphor, that way of looking at it, allowed me to create a completely different relationship to the issue, such that it didn't feel like an issue anymore. I was just like, oh, so it's obvious. I'm trying to do something that for me, right now, doesn't feel realistic, doesn't feel achievable, and it's not me, it's not my capability, it's this situation, it's this thing that I'm trying to do and this thing that I'm trying to create that simply isn't doable for me, where I am right now. And the issue just stopped feeling like an issue, it just became really obvious. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to either stop doing some stuff and really get on with being in the chrysalis and developing and evolving and transforming, or I need to decide that I'm going to carry on being the caterpillar for a while. It just, all that angst just went away. It was a paradigm shift. It changed my relationship to the issue. And it wasn't, this particular example didn't come through a coaching session. It just came from me having an opportunity to think out loud, and for someone to just ask me the question, well, what's it like? Come up with something that it's like. Paradigm shift. So the piece around creative imagery, images and photographs. So we've talked about an image can be worth 1,000 words. And we're just going to work with 3 because we haven't got time for 1,000. But I'm just curious, looking at this picture, what are 3 words that come up for you that represents what this picture means to you? Okay? 3 words that when you look at this picture, capture what this picture means to you. And I just want you to turn to the person next to you and just share those 3 words. What does this picture represent to you? Okay, let's come back together. So recognising that was very, very quick, perhaps already starting to get a sense that we can start to instantly relate ourselves to an image, to a picture, and instantly start to tap in and identify what it is about that image that might feel meaningful to us. And I really enjoy working with image cards. There's a couple of ways that we can work with them. We can invite our client to randomly select an image, so perhaps pick one blind. We might work with sets of image cards, or we might collect a stack of postcards together that just have a collection of different images that we can use, and we can ask our client to just pick one blind. And looking at that picture, how does that potentially relate? How might it relate to the issue or the challenge or the thing that we're exploring? It just invites in new information, new ways of looking at things, new perspectives. It may or may not be useful, but often the client will immediately start to identify how that image might relate to them in ways that are very unique to them. But we can also work with images and ask our client to select images. So we might offer them a series of images that they might then go through and select the ones that particularly speak to them and help to really paint a picture of what we're exploring. So I'd like to share with you one of my ways of of working with image cards. I've called this the Nash process in a moment of egotism. So this kind of invites the client to use an image metaphor to identify their possible needs. So one of the things that I find really useful, as well as identifying or helping the client to identify what are their core values, is inviting them to identify what might their key needs be, their present needs, in the here and now. What are their needs, and what might be some of the most important needs that are showing up for them when they think about the next chapter of their life that they want to create for themselves. And what I do is I give them a set of images. I work with a few different sets of image cards. I'm going to share them with you later in case you're interested in checking them out for yourself. So I share them, and I just say go through these images, select anything that resonates with you when you're thinking about the next chapter of your life and what you'd really like to be there as part of it. And it's a bit like flicking through a catalogue when you're thinking about redecorating your house. You might not know how you want it to look. You're flicking through the catalogue and picking out ideas. Oh, that looks nice, or I like that colour, I like that texture, I like this, I like that. You're not putting any pressure on yourself to actually know what the end result's going to look like yet. And then I ask the client to select that down to a few images, the ones that are most powerful and resonate with them the most strongly, and they feel most attached to. And then we explore, one by one, what does each image represent to them when they're thinking about the next chapter and what feels really important to them, what they'd really like to be there. What does it represent to them, and how is that important to them? So we start to get a sense of this image that they've just picked based on gut instinct, or it just appeals to them. They might not even know why they've picked it. We can just start to identify what does it represent to them that feels important, and how is that thing important. So we're drilling it down until we're really crystallising it into just a few words that just really captures the essence of what that image represents to them. And then we use those images and those words as a bit of a compass in the ongoing coaching, just inviting the client and giving me something that I can use as a bit of a sense check, to just check in around, is what we're creating aligned to these needs that they have? Is it going to meet their needs? And if it is, great. And if it isn't, why are they doing it? They might have a really good reason for doing it, but this is about bringing all this stuff up to the level of consciousness, awareness, so that they're making conscious, aware, informed decisions about how they might want to move forward. And I sometimes invite them to turn it into a bit of a vision board, if that's something that appeals to them, and have it as a visual representation. So not just coming away from a session with a few kind of handwritten notes in a notebook, but having something that they can turn into something visual and perhaps put somewhere where they're going to see it several times a day and really start to anchor it in. So again, this is a picture from a coaching session in the camper van. These are the cards and the images from a session, blue tacked to the furniture in there. And this, just showing some of the images and the words that my client connected with them. So the picture of the laughing child, we've got content, free, unattached. These were some of the key ingredients that this client wanted to create for themselves, this need that they felt they had to feel content and free and unattached in the next chapter. So another way that we can work with creative imagery is through drawings. I love this approach. It can really shift people's perspectives. So I ask them, if you were to create a drawing or a picture that really represents what that's like, or how you would like that to be, what would that be? And again, we can ask the client to physically draw it, to give them pen, paper, pastels, paints, whatever, and actually create a drawing. or we might ask them to simply visualise it and describe it to us. And this is one of mine from about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's still with me very, very strongly. It had a real profound impact when I was thinking about the life that I wanted to create for myself, the work-life balance, the work experience. And I was asked to create a picture in my mind of what that was going to look like for me. And I had this really clear image of I was sitting cross-legged, there were all these multicoloured, multi-texture threads coming in from lots of different directions, and my hands were in my lap collecting all these threads and weaving them into something that was uniquely mine. And that it was really important that there was this variety and this mixture of colours and textures. And it helped me get really clear that for me it felt important at that time that I didn't want to just pick one thing and just do that. I wanted to do lots of different things and create this blended approach, this pick and mix life for myself. And this image that I created and I drew has stayed with me very powerfully ever since, because it was unique and meaningful to me. So again, this is very, very quick work that we can do with our client. It doesn't take a whole session, it's just we can just ask them very briefly if you were going to create a picture or an image that really captures how you'd like this to be, or what this is like, what would that be? What would it look like? We can do a comparison. What's a picture of how it is now, and what's a picture of how you would like it to be? And then examine what are the differences between those images. And finally, guided visualization. So there's loads of ways to use visualization in coaching, but there's some of them that specifically, explicitly draw on symbolism and on metaphors. So working with visualization comes from the work that is done in psychology, it's done in hypnotherapy, it's present in meditation, in mindfulness training, and it's used very, very effectively in sports with athletes in terms of visualizing themselves doing something before they do it. That the brain actually convinces the body that they've done something before they've actually done it. Incredibly powerful. In terms of using creative visualization and guided visualization in a way that feels particularly symbolic or particularly focusing around metaphors, it can be a really gentle and powerful way to focus and direct and invite in the client's imagination. We might work with an imagined future, so you mentioned future pacing earlier. This is absolutely something that we might do using visualization. We might ask the client to use physical movement as a metaphor or to symbolize movement through time travel. We might ask them to pick physical spaces in the room that represent the past and the present and the future, so that the physical space becomes symbolic, the physical space becomes a metaphor. We might ask our client to create a symbolic landscape for themselves. So perhaps ask them to imagine a place where they feel exactly as they want to feel. And we might explore then what's there in that landscape, and what might each of those elements represent. Or we might invite them to go, oh, there we go, symbolic landscape. We might invite them to go on a symbolic journey. So we might take them through a journey that feels symbolic, guide them on an imagined journey, and then explore the symbolism of what they encountered or noticed along the way. So all these ways that we can work with metaphors, with imagery, through photographs, through physical images, through drawings, through visualization. So, what have we covered? I mean, we've been here just up to an hour. We've covered a lot. We've talked about what is a metaphor, how are they useful and powerful to work with in coaching. We've talked about different types of metaphors, influences, how we might bring them into our client work. We've looked at how we might do that verbally using words and language. We've looked at how we might work with images and pictures, and you now have the Nash process in your toolkit. We've looked at how you might invite the client to do drawings or visualise drawings. And we've looked at how we might work with visualisations. So my question is, did I succeed in whetting your appetite? So if I did, then there is some further exploration that you might want to do. And this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, it's just to give you a bit of a sense of where you might go to find out more about this work. So for those of you who are readers, there's a few books there that you might want to check out. And again, these slides, I believe, are being sent out, so you'll have this list of resources to have a look at. There's quite a big focus there on clean language and the David Grove work and symbolic modelling, because it is such a powerful way to work with, to do this work with metaphors. For the watchers among you, there's a TED Talk that you might be interested in checking out by Caitlin Walker. And she's talking there about how metaphors and clean languaging have impacted her and impacted her work and how she uses them. And she kind of tells some really great stories to bring that to life. And for the doers amongst you, there are links to find out more about the decks of image cards that I spoke about earlier that I use in my practice. So that's it. Hasn't the time gone fast? It's absolutely whizzed past. I want to just thank you so much for your time and energy and attention and listening to all of that. As Rob said, there will be an opportunity for some questions and answers in a moment. But for now, thank you so much.